crisis. We're a non-for-profit led and run by young people, designed to connect young leaders with decision makers and decision-making forums. We select high potential young people from all across Australia to undertake a policy fellowship. Our policy fellows publish recommendations for Australian domestic policy. And I have had the absolute pleasure of getting to know these 5 wonderful policy fellows over the last few months. They are all adeptly investigating tangible ways Australian policy can be implemented and leveraged to tackle the climate crisis. And who better to write these policies than the young people of our planet? After all, these are the people who will have to deal with the consequences of the decisions made today at the COP28, all the way up until about the beginning of the next century. So, they're currently in the research and discovery phase of their policy proposal projects, and they're here today to talk to you and present their initial findings and also test their ideas. So, we do have a QR code on every single slide. We encourage everyone to scan that because you can write feedback and your questions, which we'll get to at the end. We have very high expectations of this cohort, so please don't be scared to challenge them a little bit. Don't go easy on them. We want to make sure that the policies that they publish in a few months are well developed and they've been investigated from every angle possible. So that's enough of me talking. I'm very excited to present Alex Blackborough, our first policy fellow, who will be presenting to you his policy on engagement between Australian and Pacific youth.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex, as Early said. I'm up here. Hello. So I'm studying law and environmental science at Griffith University on the Gold Coast. I've spent 4 months this year living in Vanuatu, so that's kind of the basis for my policy proposal, looking at increasing engagement between First Australians and Pacific Islander people for development of climate policy and also for feedback on Australian policy in the Pacific. So, commendably, Australia has upgraded its foreign policy work in the Pacific recently, but that's undermined by 2 criticisms at times. Firstly, our lack of internal Indigenous advisory engagement, and secondly, criticisms that our work in the Pacific is in response to strategic challenges posed by other foreign nations. So my policy proposal builds off the recent appointment of the Ambassador for First Nations people, Mr. Justin Muhammad. He's been tasked with improving First Nations outreach in foreign policy in the Pacific region, and a way of doing that is to incorporate their perspectives alongside our approach to Pacific Islander policy. My proposal looks at the form of that dialogue. So among the Pacific Islands, there's a concept called Talanoa. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. And among First Nations people, the concept of yarning. They're very similar processes, and it's a way of conversing between people with an understanding of the background of the person you're conversing with. So each of the Pacific Island countries have different variations of this and also different forms of discussion outside of that Talanoa process. My policy proposal suggests that we should be incorporating the different perspectives of these island nations when we converse with them, and also incorporate concepts of yarning into those processes as well. This will increase the effectiveness of the feedback we're receiving and also acknowledges some of the historical ties between First Nations people and Pacific Islanders. Thank you for your time. I'll pass on to Callum.
Hi everybody, my name is Callum Noon. I'm a Master in Environment and Climate Emergency student at Curtin University in Western Australia, and I grew up in Wajak Noongar Budja in the southwest of Western Australia near Margaret River. So my policy proposal is looking at the ways in which the Australian government can integrate the Sustainable Development Goals in a more meaningful and integrated manner, and through my research I've determined the most effective way to do so is through the integration of them into the national budget. So currently Australia is tracking quite well in the SDGs overall. We're achieving many of the indicators. However, after COVID, we found some stagnation has occurred, more specifically in economic inequality and then action on climate change also. Even though with the new government there's been some very rapid improvements in that, there's still a long way to go until we reach a level where we can achieve any of the goals in full. So the reason I'm so interested in it is, as part of my gap year after high school, I worked at the Shire of Augusta Margaret River in 2017, just after the adoption of the goals in 2015. And with that is a strong integration with local government, which has been shown through Australia's first voluntary national review. And local government has been the basis to much of the action undertaken on SDGs, along with non-for-profit organisations. So I'm looking to expand that up into the federal government. Whilst DFAT's taken on the process so far, it's stagnated itself, and the new Albanese government hasn't necessarily integrated them also. So I'm looking at finding a way in which it's approachable, integratable, and not too overwhelming for the public service, whilst also providing opportunity for transparency for industry and civil society to work together with the government to achieve the SDGs in time for 2030, and therefore strengthen Australia's goals and ambitions in sustainable development into the future. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Emily Lech-Avenel. I'm from Curtin University in Western Australia, and my policy focuses on food waste and how we can better repurpose this and reduce it. So I recently returned from a study tour in Norway, where I was able to become involved in their society and their sustainability. And I realised that such a collectivist society that actually cares for their world should be something that we are trying to do as well. So I walked around the streets, I saw signs where they had tuck, which means thanks, and I asked them, what does this mean? And they said, we're just thanking everyone around us for recycling, for caring. And this is the attitude that I really want to bring to Australia. And I believe that we can start with something like food waste, which targets multiple sectors of society, such as those that are struggling to buy food. And this can be done through basically mandating or creating an incentive for supermarkets to donate this edible food to charity banks. So I thought I'd state some statistics to show how much is actually going to waste. So currently 7.3 million tonnes of food waste is going to landfill. This is $36.6 billion annually. So this is a problem. Food waste contributes to 3% of our annual greenhouse gas emissions, and the water used to grow this food that is wasted is equivalent to 5 Sydney harbours. The area used to grow it is 25 million hectares. Now let's consider this going to a better place. So supermarkets are the major contributors to this food waste, and this is because it's usually more feasible for this food waste to go to landfill instead of being repurposed. So Food Bank in Australia stated that food waste could provide 100 million meals a year, and already 2 million households are struggling with food. So I see a correlation here. My policy focuses on incentivising donations and penalising per tonne of waste going to landfill. And many states, including Victoria, have legislation on this or projects. However, we're missing this federal standard or this we're missing this uniform process that could lead to a more circular and collectivist society. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Shree, and I'm from the University of Melbourne, and I'm a Master of Public Health student. So I come at this from a different angle, in that I've spent some time working in hospitals and doing my final year placement in hospitals as well, and I just saw how much waste is produced in hospitals, like physical waste, like masks, shields, things like that. But then I delved deeper into it and realised the biggest impact or biggest production of carbon emissions in hospitals is treatment and actual running of hospitals themselves. So I looked at it deeper, and I found that the hospital system in Australia currently contributes about 7% of Australia's emissions, and that I guess health systems all around the world, especially in Australia as well, will come under more pressure as climate change, the impacts of climate change increases. So to combat this, my policy focuses on reviewing and identifying low-value care options and removing them or reducing them from our health system. By doing so, we'll then reduce their carbon emissions as well. So for examples, therapies that can be substituted with a low-carbon alternative. This is things such as like sevoflurane and desflurane as anaesthesia. They currently contribute 2,500 times more atmospheric warming than carbon dioxide, which is a significant amount. So that means an hour of using this anaesthesia means that is equivalent to a car travelling about 200 kilometres, which is quite significant. The University of Paris and the University of Heidelberg hospitals had success in using only intravenous anaesthesia, which drastically cut their emissions. Another one, an example of low-value care is, I guess, vitamin D blood tests. 78% of vitamin D blood tests occurring in Australia have no clinical significance at all. This is equivalent to about 42,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide, but also $87 million of taxpayer funds annually, which is a significant amount. We can understand what therapies are of low value and what therapies are of high carbon cost by undertaking a review, and the governments can then act on this. This approach will reduce carbon emissions by identifying and removing unnecessary health procedures, and in turn reduce taxpayer expenses and overall minimise the health sector's carbon emissions. And I'll pass it over to Faith.
Hi, my name is Faith. I'm studying economics and finance at the University of Melbourne, and my policy proposal looks at how we can decarbonise the oil and gas sector, one of the most stubbornly hard to abate sectors. So the inspiration for my policy idea comes from my time working in financial M&A advisory for the oil and gas sector, and something that I was quite taken aback about and almost pleasantly surprised to see was that they actually talk about sustainability and climate every day, but at the end of the day you realise it's just all an elaborate greenwashing scheme. I think that most of the time I found I was the only person in the room who was pro-renewables and pro-energy transition, and it's a hard job, and I think this may sound a little hypocritical of me as I'm not going back to work in the sector, but I think there needs to be more people that care about the climate working in this space. I think that's what's going to push the needle at the end of the day, because rather than asking them to phase out fossil fuels from afar, that to me is only half of the issue and half of the puzzle. We need to actually create a roadmap and find a way to decide what will actually happen and what will become of these companies as they transition away from fossil fuels. It's no good pointing the finger at the sector. We need to work with them to turn the whole industry around. And by now, the science is pretty clear. If we don't phase out fossil fuels, then there's no hope of keeping the 1.5 degrees of warming target in sight. And this rapidly means phasing out fossil fuel production, one of the key points of contention at this COP, and I'm sure many of you will be following the negotiations around that in the next couple of days. But back home in Australia, it's as if none of this is happening. Woodside, Santos, and the rest of the oil and gas industry are continuing to go along with business as usual and just continuing as nothing had happened. If you think about this, that between 2016 and 2022, the top 12 fossil fuel corporations produced more emissions than 50% of total Pacific Island emissions altogether. If Australia is serious about co-hosting COP31, then we need to work with these companies to find a way to transition the industry. The phase out of fossil fuels doesn't happen overnight. We need to work with these companies to find ways for them to transition their business models. In the coal industry, we've seen at least some momentum with BHP's transition into critical minerals and the attempted takeovers of AGL and Origin Energy, the work of activist investors like Matt Cannon-Brookes pushing to decarbonise and accelerate the closure of coal plants more quickly. But on the other hand, the oil and gas sector remains completely stagnant with no such changes at all. And I think at the crux of this is the inherent paradox between the oil and gas companies' business model and the goal of climate change mitigation. Basically, these companies struggle to envision where they fit within an industry that's not heavily reliant on oil and gas, and as a result, the sector tends to advocate for pathways that favour their existing capabilities and infrastructure. So as we've seen, for example, trying to focus on scope 1 and 2 emissions and steering the policy dialogue towards that, for example, with the methane pledge, and also relying on unproven technologies like carbon capture and storage, which have failed to deliver on time, budget and capacity, yet are still being used as a tool to justify fossil fuel expansion. And so this brings me to my first recommendation, establishing a sector-specific roadmap for the oil and gas sector. It's becoming increasingly clear that oil and gas needs to be phased out, but the role of abatement technologies like carbon capture and storage is far less clear. And so the government needs to make clear that this is not a credible transition strategy. The current Albanese government, a spokesperson, has acknowledged that CCS does not stack up scientifically or financially, and withdrawn funding for CCS, as well as limiting the Hydrogen Head Start program to green hydrogen projects only, as opposed to blue hydrogen projects, which include CCS, which is a great first step, but this needs to be backed up with a more rigorous and objective assessment framework that clearly delineates what constitutes a credible transition pathway for the oil and gas industry. And so in terms of what actually constitutes a credible transition pathway, well, there are really two options. Either these companies essentially wind down and cease to exist and return the money to shareholders in the form of buybacks, or they transition their business models from producers of fossil fuels to producers of clean energy. And while the first strategy is obviously more popular among investors and the more desirable option, I do think it is more unrealistic to expect that oil and gas companies will go against what they've ever known about production, growth, and really the basic principles of business management to willingly wind down their business and I guess cease to exist. And I'm not aware of any instances where that has happened before. On the other hand, I think the renewables pathway holds a lot more potential and hasn't been extensively explored because there are actually a lot of synergies between oil and gas and offshore wind. The Danish company Ørsted provides an inspiring example of how it is possible to transition from a fossil fuel company to one of the biggest renewable energy superpowers in the world, and today they're the largest offshore wind developer in the world. And also, Equinor is another example. They built the world's first floating offshore wind farm using their expertise from the oil and gas work that they've been doing for 50 years. So I think that one area that's worth looking into is the potential of repurposing oil and gas infrastructure into renewable energy infrastructure. And there have only been a few early stage studies done in this space, but with the scale decommissioning that's about to be happening over the next decade, I think there is significant opportunity to look at repurposing this infrastructure into renewable energy production. So that's an overview of my policy papers. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much to the Policy Fellows, and thank you to the audience for putting some pretty difficult questions in the feedback. But I did ask for that at the start, so that's on me. Sorry, guys. There's still a QR code up on the screen, so if anyone has any questions or feedback, you can also raise your hands as well, but we might jump straight into the questions. So. The first one is for Alex, and I might just give you the mic. You have a mic? So what do you think are the key priorities that Australia and the Pacific should collaborate on for the COP31?
Well, primarily climate change is the obvious answer to that one. But in terms of additional priorities, I think food security, looking at the energy transition for the Pacific, especially considering the available land space and the potential options in that region. The other aspect of COP31 that I think is really crucial for Australia is how we approach it in terms of giving value to the opinions of our Indigenous people. and our First Nations people. This is an opportunity for us to collaborate with them on equal ground and show the Pacific that we can and are willing to do that, especially after the recent referendum and how that reflects on us within the Pacific. I think this is an opportunity to build on our reputation and also rectify any potential harm that may have caused. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Our next question is to Callum. So your policy is to do with implementing the SDGs into federal budgeting. What are the areas that aren't tracking well, and what mechanisms do you propose can be implemented to address this?
So the primary areas in which Australia isn't currently tracking well is economic inequality, so goal 10, and then the climate-based goals, so 13, 14 and 15. Everything else is relatively decent and is tracking okay. However, Australia still isn't on track to achieve one single goal in full. There's always a single indicator which Australia cannot satisfy, which is frustrating, but that's also just the reality of dealing with a complex, mixed, free market economy. I think through integrating into the budget, it presents an opportunity for non-for-profits and for-profit organisations to understand the approach that government's taking in completing environmental goals as a whole, which subsequently satisfy the indicators which exist under each of the SDGs. So therefore, if you're implementing a policy initiative and trying to fund something to do with offshore wind, for example, then it ticks a goal which then is able to be put into specific analysation things, like Mexico uses spiderweb graph, and that itself then provides transparency to the private and the private sector and non-governmental organisations and where the government is currently sitting. It allows for more transparency and less government spin. It allows for them to understand what the government is actually doing rather than what it's trying to show and tell what it's doing. And by doing so, we achieve transparency, which is the core. Without transparency, you can't have climate action. You can have private sector companies trying to say that we're doing this and that, and meanwhile fugitive emissions are leaking into the environment and destroying all the progress because of methane. Without transparency on that, without transparency from government, it just means nothing. There's no basis to any of it, and everyone just pretends like things are happening when they're not.
Very well said. We have the next question for Emily. An issue with food circularity is that poor households are left with low quality food waste. How can we ensure dignity with food waste when implementing a policy?
That's really interesting because I did look into this as well, and a lot of the food banks that are currently operating as private operations actually have regulatory measures in place to understand. Is it on? Oh, okay. Understand to see the quality of the food. So one video I saw of Food Bank collecting this food was they went through a checklist to see that this food could be made into a meal, could be refrigerated for another week, certain standards that it met, and this ensured that all the food that was then given to either restaurants to pass on to charity banks or trucks that went out to people struggling to find food was that it was of high quality. So I think mandating or creating a guideline for each of the states to have is better than saying exactly what standards they have to meet, because then the states can adjust this. But having our framework there is the necessary next step, because from that, quality standards can be put in place for each organisation. Thanks.
Thanks, Em. Shri, do you think your proposal will be controversial in the medical community? we'd imagine that it's sort of contentious to put a price on health in terms of carbon, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. It depends on, I guess, the area that the doctor or the professional is working in, but I guess in context of climate change, we're expecting that infectious diseases and the likes will increase in Australia and further down south along the border, along the coast as well. So you can see through ramping issues in hospitals during COVID and such that hospitals are always under pressure. So if there are less therapies there are less effective therapies in place, the clinical outcome is not good. And if we keep putting funds into that, there's less good care being put out there. And by ensuring that the quality of care is good, that the therapies work, but also have a low carbon cost, we're achieving good clinical outcomes and good carbon emissions as well in hospitals. So I think it's overall going to be a positive. Obviously, there are clinical and medical professionals out there that have their own preferences about what medical procedures are done, but overall it will decrease pressure on our medical and hospital sector, but also provide a better result in terms of carbon emissions as well.
Cool. Faye. Oh, wait. Yes. How do you propose... actually, I think I like the next question better. The option 2 that you've outlined proposes repurposing infrastructure from fossil fuel infrastructure to renewable energy. Do you see the government subsidising or incentivising these transitions? And if not, how else do you propose this would work?
I think that's a wonderful question. It's definitely important to incentivise the transition. Like, after all, it's the government's role to give a push to these companies and show some leadership in what is a credible transition pathway forward for the oil and gas industry. In terms of the decommissioning study, the feasibility study that I proposed, certainly it will need government funding, but I think it can be implemented as part of the decommissioning roadmap that's currently being implemented by the Department of Industry, Science and Resources. Australia has a huge decommissioning, I guess you could see it as a liability or an opportunity, but there's a lot of decommissioning work that needs to be happening over the next decade. And so it makes sense to at least explore this opportunity of whether it is possible to repurpose decommissioned or about to be decommissioned infrastructure into renewable energy infrastructure. There have been studies conducted elsewhere in other parts of the world that the government can build off. There was one study conducted in Scotland that highlighted the potential for offshore oil and gas infrastructure to be repurposed into wind energy powered hydrogen infrastructure offshore. And some other studies in parts of the world, but those were, I think, quite heavily skewed towards carbon capture and storage. And if you look at the membership base on the committees conducting these studies, it's not hard to see why. So yeah, I guess it's important for the government to incentivise this, and I think it would fit very well within the decommissioning work that needs to be done, and it's a good opportunity for the government to be a pioneer in this space of research. I think we really could.
Thanks, Faith. I just wanted to throw it out to the audience. Was there any further questions just in person that you haven't put through the QR code? Because we do have more questions, but I realise that some people don't love to use the technology for these sorts of things. That's fine. We will keep rolling. I just want to ask the tech crew, are we finishing now or do we still have time? Well, we have time. Okay. Callum, we have another SDG question. I really like this one. So the SDGs are contradictory and prioritise economic growth. Why are the SDGs the best way to ensure sustainability in Australia? And have you seen any other better models?
The SDGs aren't perfect. I'm well aware about the contradictory nature. In my personal opinion, the economics justifies the contradiction. I believe that the concept of sustainable development itself, it could be argued to be flawed, because how can you have sustainable development in the long term because it's slowly going to use natural resources and all the rest. The SDGs as a basis are about people, planet and prosperity. Through the maximisation of utility for individuals, they're offered an opportunity to better their living standards, so that's the people side. Planet, there is a contradiction between maximising economics and people's and the preservation of the natural environment, yet the structure of the goals themselves, whilst contradictory, you can still achieve everything at the same time, and I reject the premise that you can't. People and prosperity, to me, are integrated completely, and through maximising people's incomes and therefore their living standards, that's just the best outcome possible. And so therefore, through putting them in the budget, you're strengthening that tie between budgetary outcomes and the SDGs and sustainable development as a whole. And by doing so, you end up with a more interconnected, peaceful and prosperous world for the future.
Thanks, Callum. We have one more for Emily. So how do you see these incentives working? Maybe I should preface these questions with your policy, sorry. So you're looking at mandating edible food waste is to be donated instead of going to landfill. So how do you see these incentives working to counter the additional resourcing ask for small businesses part of your policy proposal?
I think most of my research has been on those larger retailers such as the Coles, the Woolies. However, I think with more research, which will be coming in the next few weeks, into my policy, it would be interesting to see how those would extend to smaller businesses, because I'm not saying that there's no waste coming from these, but the difference between those and the ones at scale in all states is large. So I think a modified version of the guidelines should apply to smaller businesses. However, I'd like to do more research on this before I give a final answer. So if whoever asked the question would like to come up and introduce themselves at the end, I'd love to get your details, because I will be researching this further and I can get back to you with a better, more prepared answer in a few weeks. Thanks.
Thanks, Em. And yeah, that's the point of having these questions, is to further inform the research, look at it from other angles. So I do appreciate that question a lot. Shri, I have a question for you. What would you say to those who contend the testing you're proposing phasing out? Sorry, I'll give this context as well. So you're looking at phasing out or sort of disincentivizing high carbon, low health procedures, like you've listed vitamin D testing as a low value kind of, what would you call it?
Low value
Care. So what would you say to those who contend the testing you're proposing phasing out serves an important role in enabling preventative care?
So the role of preventative care is obviously crucial, but it's what research has shown that is unnecessary as well, is that we can all take blood tests on a weekly basis to ensure that there is some sort of, that we're all healthy constantly. But the fact of the matter is that we'll all have certain health conditions throughout our lives, and constantly testing and constantly making sure that we're okay is not the best way to take care of, I guess, the well-being of everyone. Routine health checks is crucial for people's well-being, but I guess the commercialization of, like in America where they do full body scans and like all these blood tests, they contribute so much medical waste and energy waste that's not necessary to pick up the smallest amount of some medical condition that's not going to really affect their lives long term either. So it's making sure that the care that we provide is high value, It's low carbon emission, and it's also, taxpayer effective as well, because if we just fund everything, like, we may as well, it's just too much medical procedures, and it's just, the cost is too much.
Great, and we've got one last question for Alex. How will your policy, so Alex, you're looking at building the relationship between Pacific and Australian Indigenous people. How will your policy factor in engaging directly with underrepresented groups?
So by underrepresented groups, I assume you mean more marginalised groups of Indigenous people within Australia. So that's partly where the referendum failed, I think. So my policy proposal is still looking into that side of things. But yeah, at the moment, I don't have an answer on that point. But it's more, the proposal is more focused on the nature of the dialogue that we do implement. So our ambassador for First Nations people is looking at how to initiate that dialogue and how best to reflect all of those different perspectives. There hasn't been an outcome on exactly how to do that yet, but yeah, I'll be following that closely.
Great, and we'll go to our very last question, is for Faith. How would you create a working relationship with gas companies when they continue to betray our trust and prioritise profits and expansion over decarbonisation? So we'll end on a slightly controversial one. But thanks.
That's a great question, and one I think I'd love to chat to more people about if anyone has any ideas. I think the way for that to happen is that there needs to be a business case for a more credible transition pathway. A credible transition pathway isn't just one that's aligned with the Paris Agreement, but it's also one that comes at the lowest economic cost. And these companies are continuing to, actually they're already working with the government in terms of gaining funding for carbon capture and storage and going down that pathway, which is much, much, much more high cost to taxpayers if it's being funded with public money, and also to the companies themselves. And so I think that dialogue around the technologies and what works to decarbonise, it needs to shift from carbon capture and storage and false solutions like that to meaningful, genuine change, and obviously the pathway to renewables and other sorts of transition pathways. It isn't fully fleshed out yet, but I think there is already a dialogue that's going on between the government and oil and gas companies. It just needs to shift more. And the government can, I think, do a lot in leading the way in that dialogue in the industry.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'd like to invite everyone to give our fellows a round of applause. So, excellent policy ideas, and it just goes to show that, you know, people under the age of 30 can think about these sorts of ideas and come up with really tangible, practical and implementable solutions, and that's exactly, the goal of Global Voices. So I just wanted to thank all of the audience members for coming along and participating, and I'd also really love to thank Jared and Laura from DQ, who have been absolutely amazing in helping us get here and also for organising this event for us. So thank you so much. And please come up and talk to the fellows if you have any other feedback or questions.